Rambo First Blood Part 2begins with one of the most important questions surrounding John Rambo after the events of the first film. What happens to a soldier who survived war, survived the wilderness, survived the people who hunted him, and still cannot find a place in ordinary society? The answer is presented through a darker and much more action focused story that takes Rambo back to the environment that created him, the Vietnam War. But this time, he is not returning as the same broken fugitive audiences met in the first movie. Because the events of First Blood have already established that Rambo possesses extraordinary combat abilities, and the sequel takes those abilities and places them inside a dangerous military mission where survival once again becomes his greatest challenge. And released in 1985, Rambo First Blood Part 2 expands the character from a troubled Vietnam veteran into a full scale action hero, while still keeping the emotional connection between Rambo and Colonel Sam Troutman at the center of the story. And from the opening moments, the film makes it clear that Rambo's life has not returned to normal because he is serving a prison sentence after the events of the first film, living in a harsh environment where his physical strength and military discipline have become tools for survival. And although he is behind bars, the audience immediately understands that Rambo has not lost the skills that made him so dangerous in the previous story, because he remains physically powerful, disciplined, and capable of enduring conditions that would break most people. And this opening is important because it shows that the government has not forgotten about him, even though society has struggled to understand him. And Colonel Trotman eventually arrives with a proposition that could change Rambo's future. And Trotman is once again played by Richard Crenna, whose presence provides continuity with the first film and reminds the audience that there is at least one person who understands what Rambo is capable of and how his mind works. And Trotman explains that a special mission is being planned in Vietnam, a mission designed to gather information about American prisoners of war who may still be alive. And the government needs someone with Rambo's unique abilities to enter the territory, investigate the situation, photograph the evidence, and return without being detected. And this mission immediately presents Rambo with a difficult choice, because returning to Vietnam means returning to the place that caused much of his psychological suffering. But it also gives him an opportunity that few other people could offer him, a chance to return as a soldier rather than a prisoner, and perhaps prove that he still has a purpose. And this is where the film begins reshaping Rambo's character. Because in First Blood, he was fighting against authority, while in the sequel, he is temporarily working with authority. But the relationship is still complicated because Rambo has learned that institutions can betray soldiers, and he does not completely trust the people giving him orders. Yet, his connection with Trotman gives him enough confidence to accept the mission. And Trotman understands that Rambo is uniquely suited for the job because he knows how to operate behind enemy lines, how to survive in the jungle, how to move silently, and how to function under extreme pressure. And these abilities are exactly what the mission requires. And as the government officials explain the operation, the plan appears simple on paper. Rambo will enter Vietnam with a small amount of equipment, locate a suspected prisoner of war camp, gather photographic evidence, and return. But from the beginning, the audience can sense that the mission will not be as straightforward as the officials claim, because military operations involving abandoned prisoners, political pressure, and classified information rarely remain simple. And Rambo himself seems suspicious of the way the mission is being presented. But he accepts the assignment because he wants to help the men who may still be trapped in Vietnam. And this motivation is extremely important because it connects directly to the emotional wounds established in the previous movie, where Rambo spoke about how soldiers were abandoned and forgotten after returning from war. And now he is being offered a chance to find soldiers who may have been left behind. And this gives the mission a deeply personal meaning for him, because Rambo understands what it means to feel forgotten, and he cannot ignore the possibility that other American soldiers may still be suffering in the same country where he lost so much. And this is one of the strongest emotional ideas in the sequel, because Rambo is not simply going back to Vietnam to fight. He is going back because he believes there may still be men there who need someone to remember them. And this gives the mission a sense of moral urgency. And before leaving, Rambo receives instructions and equipment, and the film begins emphasizing his physical transformation into a combat operative, with his body, weapons, and military training once again becoming central to the story. But unlike the first film, where Rambo was trying to avoid violence, the sequel is designed around the expectation that combat will eventually become unavoidable. And this marks a major tonal shift, because First Blood was primarily a survival thriller with psychological drama, while First Blood Part 2 is a much larger military action adventure filled with jungle warfare, helicopters, explosions, gunfights, enemy soldiers, and elaborate combat sequences. And the change was partly driven by the desire to expand Rambo's character into a more traditional action hero. But the emotional foundation remains connected to the first movie, because Rambo is still motivated by his experiences in Vietnam. And as he prepares for the mission, the audience sees a man who is more controlled than before, but also more comfortable with the idea of returning to combat. And this is an important difference, because in the first film, his military skills are triggered by fear and survival, while in the sequel, those same skills become something he consciously chooses to use. And this transformation helps explain why Rambo becomes such an iconic action figure, because he is no longer simply reacting to danger. He is entering danger deliberately because he believes there are people who need him. And when he is sent into Vietnam, the film immediately contrasts the modern military planning surrounding him with the reality of the jungle, because the officials sitting safely behind desks can create mission objectives, but Rambo is the one who must physically survive the environment. And this contrast becomes important later, because it reveals how disconnected the decision makers are from the realities faced by soldiers. And as Rambo enters the jungle, he is introduced to the local environment and begins working with a young Vietnamese woman named Co Bao, who serves as his guide and interpreter. And her presence becomes important because Rambo needs someone who understands the local language and terrain, while Kobau also becomes emotionally connected to him, creating a human element within the otherwise militarized mission. And as the two move through the jungle, Rambo begins searching for signs of the missing prisoners, and the film starts building suspense by showing that the jungle is not simply a background. It is an active and dangerous environment filled with hidden enemies, difficult terrain, and unpredictable conditions. And Rambo's ability to move through this environment becomes one of the film's major attractions because he appears almost perfectly adapted to the jungle, using camouflage, stealth, tracking, and his physical strength to move without drawing attention. And the movie repeatedly demonstrates that the skills that made him an outcast in civilian society are precisely the skills that make him valuable in combat. And this creates an interesting contradiction within the character because the qualities that make him difficult to integrate into normal life make him exceptionally effective in war. And the sequel leans heavily into that idea, presenting Rambo as someone who was built for combat but struggles to function outside it. And this becomes even more significant because the mission is supposed to be temporary, meaning Rambo is being sent into the environment where he is most capable, but he is also being asked to follow strict limitations. And this creates tension between his instincts and the orders he receives. Because Rambo's military experience tells him to adapt to the situation, while the mission's political objectives require him to remain within a narrow set of instructions. And this conflict becomes increasingly important as he discovers evidence that the situation is not what he was told. And as Rambo moves deeper into enemy territory, he begins finding signs that American prisoners may actually be alive. And this changes the nature of the mission completely because the information he was given suggested that the mission was primarily about gathering photographic evidence. But Rambo discovers that there may be actual human beings being held captive, and for him, that possibility is impossible to ignore because leaving those men behind would contradict everything he believes about the responsibility of soldiers to one another. And this creates the first major conflict between Rambo and the people controlling the mission from a distance. Because Rambo is willing to risk everything to rescue the prisoners, while the officials want him to follow the original plan and return with evidence. And this difference between military objectives and human responsibility becomes one of the central themes of the film. And Rambo's decision to investigate further demonstrates that he is not simply following orders, he is following his own moral code. And that moral code was shaped by his experience in Vietnam, where he learned that soldiers can be abandoned by the systems that sent them to war. And now he refuses to abandon another soldier if he can help. And as Rambo continues his mission, the film introduces one of its most important visual symbols, the jungle itself. Because Vietnam is presented as both a battlefield and a place of memory for Rambo. And every step he takes through the environment brings him closer to the memories of his past. But instead of allowing those memories to paralyze him, he uses them to guide his actions. And this is a major difference from the first film, because Rambo is now entering the place that traumatized him voluntarily. And this suggests that he is attempting to reclaim control over his memories. And although the film does not always explore this psychological dimension in great detail, it remains present beneath the action. Because Rambo's return to Vietnam is not simply a military mission, it is also a confrontation with the past. And this gives the sequel emotional continuity. And as the mission progresses, the relationship between Rambo and Kobau develops, and she begins to see that he is not simply a dangerous American soldier, but someone who genuinely cares about the prisoners and is willing to risk his life to help them. And this human connection gives Rambo a reason to trust someone again, which is significant because the first film established how deeply his ability to trust had been damaged, and Kobau's willingness to help him provides a brief sense of companionship in an otherwise hostile environment, and the jungle around them becomes increasingly dangerous as enemy forces begin moving closer, forcing Rambo to rely on his training. And this is where the action begins intensifying, with the film showcasing the character's ability to move through enemy territory almost undetected. And the audience starts seeing the difference between the Rambo of First Blood and the Rambo of the sequel. Because the first movie focused on traps and survival techniques designed primarily to avoid killing, while the sequel gives Rambo a much more offensive role, allowing him to use weapons and combat tactics in a direct military setting. And this shift was crucial to the franchise's development because it transformed Rambo into one of the defining action heroes of the 1980s. And Sylvester Stallone's physical presence becomes a major part of the character's identity because Rambo is presented as extremely strong, disciplined, and capable. But the film still gives him moments of vulnerability, particularly when he encounters the prisoners and realizes that they have been suffering for years. And this emotional reaction reminds the audience that beneath the muscles and weapons is still the same man who simply wants to help soldiers who were forgotten. And as Rambo gets closer to the prisoner camp, the mission becomes increasingly dangerous, and he realizes that the people holding the prisoners are better organized and more heavily armed than he initially expected. But he continues forward because turning back would mean abandoning the men he came to find. And this determination becomes one of his defining characteristics. Because once Rambo decides that someone needs his help, he is willing to accept almost any level of danger. And this also explains why he is so difficult for the authorities to control, because his moral decisions are based on loyalty rather than bureaucracy. And as the story develops, the audience begins to understand that the mission may contain another layer of deception because the officials who sent Rambo into Vietnam do not seem interested in the possibility of actually rescuing prisoners. And this raises questions about why they would send one of their most capable soldiers into such a dangerous environment if they were unwilling to support him when he finds what he was looking for. And these questions become increasingly important as Rambo's discovery creates a political problem. Because acknowledging that American prisoners remain in Vietnam would force the government to deal with an issue it may prefer to keep hidden. And this introduces one of the sequel's central themes, the idea of abandoned soldiers and political denial. And Rambo's personal mission becomes connected to a larger question about responsibility. Because if the prisoners are alive, who is responsible for bringing them home? And if the government refuses to act, what does that say about the promises made to soldiers who served? And these questions echo the emotional themes of First Blood, where Rambo felt that society had forgotten the men who fought in Vietnam. And now the sequel turns that personal feeling into the central mission of the story. And as Rambo moves deeper into the camp, the tension increases because he must remain hidden while gathering evidence. But his discovery of the prisoners creates an impossible choice. Because following orders means leaving them behind, while rescuing them could compromise the entire mission and potentially cost him his life. And Rambo ultimately chooses the prisoners because he cannot walk away from men who have been abandoned. And this decision sets the stage for the major conflict that will define the rest of the film. Because once Rambo decides to rescue them, he is no longer simply an operative carrying out a mission. He becomes a soldier acting according to his conscience. And this is where the sequel's action begins to take on a more emotional meaning. Because every fight that follows is connected to his determination to bring those men home. And as he prepares to make his move, the audience can see that the mission has already changed him. Because returning to Vietnam has awakened memories and emotions that had been buried for years. But instead of running from them, he is confronting them directly. And this gives his character a sense of purpose that was missing at the beginning of the film. And Colonel Trotman remains an important figure throughout this process because he believes in Rambo's abilities and understands his emotional connection to the mission. But the people above him have different priorities, and this creates tension within the military command structure because Trotman sees Rambo as a soldier who deserves support, while others see him as an expendable asset. And this conflict becomes increasingly obvious as the mission begins to go wrong, and the audience is therefore introduced to another important theme: the difference between soldiers and the institutions that command them. Because Rambo is willing to sacrifice himself for the mission, while the officials are willing to sacrifice him to protect the mission's political objectives. And this contrast makes the eventual betrayal more powerful because Rambo is once again placed in a situation where the people who sent him into danger are unwilling to accept responsibility for what happens to him. And the cycle that began in Vietnam continues into the present. And as the first major stage of the mission approaches its climax, Rambo is preparing to make contact with the prisoners, and the audience understands that everything he has done so far has been leading toward this moment. Because his return to Vietnam was supposed to be about gathering evidence, but it has become a rescue mission. And that change is entirely driven by Rambo's refusal to leave another soldier behind. And this decision will have enormous consequences because once he takes action, the carefully controlled military operation will begin collapsing. And Rambo will find himself caught between enemy forces and the people who were supposed to support him. And the deeper he goes, the more obvious it becomes that his greatest challenge may not be the enemy soldiers in the jungle, but the political and military officials who are willing to abandon him when the mission becomes inconvenient. And this is what gives Rambo First Blood Part 2 its emotional foundation beneath all the action. Because at its heart, the story is about a soldier who is sent back to the place that wounded him, only to discover that the same system that once sent him to war may still be willing to sacrifice him. And instead of accepting that fate, Rambo chooses to fight. Not because he wants glory, but because he believes the men he has found deserve to come home. And as the story moves toward its next stage, the quiet reconnaissance mission is about to become a full scale battle. Rambo's loyalty will be tested. His trust in the people commanding him will begin to collapse, and the man who entered Vietnam with orders to observe will soon become the soldier determined to rescue the forgotten, regardless of what anyone back home tells him to do. Rambo's mission changes completely the moment he discovers that the possibility of American prisoners of war is not simply an old rumor, but a reality that can be seen with his own eyes. Because what began as a carefully controlled reconnaissance operation has suddenly become a deeply personal rescue mission. And Rambo knows that if he follows his original orders, he will have to leave those men behind, something he simply cannot accept after everything he has experienced in Vietnam. And this is where the difference between Rambo and the officials controlling the operation becomes clear. Because the people in command are thinking about photographs, reports, political consequences, and the success of the mission on paper, while Rambo is thinking about the men he can see suffering inside the camp. And for him, those men are not statistics or evidence. They are soldiers, brothers who have been left behind. And once Rambo makes the decision to help them, there is no turning back. And this decision also reveals how much the events of the first film still influence him. Because Rambo's greatest pain has always been the feeling that soldiers were forgotten after they had served their country. And now he has an opportunity to prove that at least one soldier has not been forgotten. And his determination to rescue the prisoners therefore becomes an act of redemption, not only for himself, but for every soldier who never made it home. And as Rambo studies the prisoner camp, he carefully observes the guards, the terrain, the buildings, the patrol patterns, and the surrounding jungle, using the same skills that made him nearly impossible to capture in the first film. But this time, he is not simply trying to survive. He is preparing to penetrate an enemy position and extract a prisoner, which requires much greater precision. And Ko Bao becomes an essential part of the operation because she understands the local language and can help Rambo communicate with people he would otherwise be unable to approach. And their relationship gradually develops into one of trust. And although the film is primarily an action movie, these quieter moments are important because they remind the audience that Rambo is still capable of forming emotional connections despite everything he has suffered. And Ko Bao sees a side of him that most people never see, the quiet man beneath the soldier, the man who is carrying memories of friends who died and a deep sense of responsibility toward people who are still suffering. And she becomes one of the few people who can understand that his violence is not motivated by a desire for power, but by a desire to protect. And as Rambo prepares for the rescue, the film begins revealing more about the complicated military operation behind him. Because the people in command are not prepared to authorize an actual rescue. And this creates a dangerous conflict between what Rambo believes is right and what his superiors want him to do. And Colonel Trotman is caught between these two worlds because he understands Rambo's motivations but is also part of the military structure that controls the mission. And this creates a complicated relationship between the two men. Because Trotman knows that Rambo is capable of completing the mission, but he also understands that Rambo will never simply walk away from American soldiers in captivity. And this is why Trotman's role is so important, because he represents the one person in authority whom Rambo still trusts. And that trust is extremely fragile, because Rambo has learned from experience that orders can be changed and promises can be broken. And as Rambo moves closer to the prisoners, the audience begins to see the scale of his courage, because he is entering a heavily guarded area with limited support, knowing that discovery could result in his death. But he continues anyway. And this is where the film starts transitioning into the larger action spectacle that made the sequel famous. Because once Rambo begins moving through the enemy territory, the jungle becomes a battlefield again, and every sound, movement, and shadow can expose him. But his training allows him to remain calm, and he uses stealth rather than brute force whenever possible, because he knows that his mission depends on surprise. And this is one of the strongest demonstrations of Rambo's military intelligence in the film, because he does not simply charge into the camp. He studies the environment and chooses the right moment to act. And when he finally reaches one of the prisoners, the emotional impact is significant, because the man represents everything Rambo was sent to investigate. An American soldier who has been living in captivity long after the war was supposedly over. And Rambo immediately understands that the situation is much worse than the officials wanted him to believe. And instead of treating the prisoner as evidence, he treats him as a human being who deserves to go home. And this decision changes the mission forever. Because now Rambo must get the prisoner out of the camp while avoiding the enemy forces surrounding them. And this creates a tense escape sequence in which Rambo's survival skills are tested against a much larger enemy force, and the prisoner is weak and physically damaged from years of captivity. Meaning, Rambo cannot simply move at full speed. He has to protect someone who cannot protect himself. And this adds another layer of difficulty to the mission, because Rambo is no longer responsible only for his own survival. He is responsible for another man's life. And this reinforces his role as a protector. And as they move through the jungle, Kobao assists them, and the three characters briefly form a small team united by a common goal. But the situation quickly becomes more dangerous, because the enemy realizes that something has happened, and patrols begin searching the area, forcing Rambo to use every skill he possesses to remain ahead of them. And the tension becomes especially strong because the audience knows that Rambo's greatest enemy is not simply the soldiers pursuing him, but the possibility that his own commanders will refuse to support him if the operation goes wrong. And this fear becomes reality as communication with the command structure begins revealing that the mission is not what Rambo believed it was. And the people controlling the operation are increasingly concerned about political consequences. And this creates one of the most frustrating aspects of the story for Rambo, because he has successfully found exactly what he was sent to find. Yet the people who sent him do not want him to bring the prisoners home. And this betrayal hits him particularly hard because it confirms the belief he has carried since Vietnam, that soldiers can be used and discarded by the people who send them into combat. And the sequel therefore turns Rambo's personal trauma into a direct conflict with military bureaucracy. And as the rescue operation continues, Rambo refuses to obey the order to abandon the prisoner. And this decision puts him directly against his own command structure. And the film uses this moment to transform Rambo from an operative into a rebel soldier once again. But unlike the first film, where his rebellion was against a small town police department, this time his conflict is much larger because he is fighting against an entire military operation that has decided his mission is no longer politically convenient. And the irony is that the government has brought him back to Vietnam because they believe he is uniquely capable of surviving there. But the moment he starts making decisions based on what he sees rather than what they want him to see, they begin treating him as a problem. And this reveals the central contradiction of the mission, because the officials want Rambo's abilities but do not want his independence. And Rambo is the kind of soldier who can survive behind enemy lines precisely because he knows how to make decisions without waiting for permission. So, attempting to control him too tightly defeats the purpose of using him in the first place. And this tension becomes even stronger as the enemy closes in, and Rambo is forced to fight his way through increasingly dangerous situations, using his knife, his bow, and whatever weapons he can find. And the film's action becomes more intense as Rambo moves from stealth to open combat. And this is where Sylvester Stallone's physical performance becomes a major part of the movie's identity. Because Rambo is presented as a soldier whose entire body has been shaped by military training, and the camera repeatedly emphasizes his strength and endurance. But the physical spectacle is not entirely empty, because Rambo's body represents the years of combat that have transformed him, and his ability to survive is both his greatest strength and his greatest curse, because the same skills that make him powerful also keep him psychologically connected to war. And as the rescue mission begins falling apart, Rambo's emotional state becomes increasingly intense. But he remains focused because the prisoner depends on him. And this is where Kobau's relationship with Rambo becomes particularly important, because she gives him a brief sense of hope in a world where betrayal has become normal. And her presence allows the audience to see that Rambo is capable of imagining a life beyond war, even if only for a short time. And their connection is not developed through long romantic conversations. Instead, it grows through shared danger and mutual trust. And Kobau understands that Rambo is carrying enormous emotional weight, while Rambo begins to see her as someone he can rely on. And this makes what happens later in the story even more painful, because the film uses their relationship to remind the audience that Rambo's world is filled with loss, and every time he allows himself to care about someone, that person becomes vulnerable to the violence surrounding him. And this pattern is one of the most tragic aspects of his character, because he wants connection, but his life continually destroys the people who become close to him. And as Rambo tries to get the prisoner to safety, he is eventually confronted by the reality that the mission has been compromised. And the people who were supposed to extract him are no longer willing to take the risk. And this is where the film's betrayal becomes complete, because Rambo has done exactly what the mission required. Yet the people who sent him into danger are prepared to leave him behind. And Colonel Trotman is forced to watch the situation deteriorate from a distance. And although he wants to help Rambo, his position within the command structure limits what he can do. And this creates one of the most emotionally complicated parts of the movie, because Trotman genuinely cares about Rambo, but he is still connected to the institution that has betrayed him. And Rambo's response to the betrayal is exactly what the audience would expect from someone with his history. He refuses to surrender, and instead, he fights back. And the film now shifts fully into survival and revenge mode, with Rambo using the jungle as his weapon and the enemy's own weaknesses against them. And this is where the sequel becomes much more explosive than the original film, because Rambo is no longer simply trying to hide, he is now actively attacking the people who have captured him and the forces responsible for holding the prisoners. And the action sequences become larger and more elaborate, featuring gunfire, explosions, helicopters, boats, and large scale military confrontations. But even in the middle of this spectacle, the emotional motivation remains clear. Because Rambo is fighting for the prisoners and for his own sense of dignity, and he refuses to allow the government to erase what he discovered. And this makes his rebellion feel personal, because the betrayal confirms everything he feared about returning to Vietnam. And instead of proving that the war is behind him, the mission shows him that its consequences are still alive. And this is why the sequel can be interpreted as both a conventional action movie and a fantasy of correcting historical injustice. Because Rambo is given the opportunity to do what many veterans wished the government had done: return to Vietnam, find the forgotten prisoners, and bring them home. And although the story is highly fictionalized and exaggerated, this emotional idea gives the movie its power. And as Rambo fights his way through enemy territory, his reputation as an almost unstoppable soldier begins taking shape. And this is where the character becomes the iconic figure audiences would remember for decades. Because he is no longer simply the wounded veteran of First Blood. He is now a symbol of strength, survival, and military competence. And the movie's visual style reinforces this transformation, with Rambo frequently shown moving through smoke, rain, mud, jungle, and explosions, creating the image of a warrior who seems almost impossible to defeat. And yet, the film continues giving him moments of emotional vulnerability, particularly in scenes involving the prisoners and Kobau. And these moments prevent the character from becoming completely one dimensional, because they remind the audience that the warrior exists because the human being has been forced into that role. And Rambo's greatest motivation is still loyalty. And this becomes especially clear when he refuses to leave the prisoners behind even after being betrayed by his own command. Because he could easily abandon the mission and save himself, but he chooses to continue fighting. And this is what separates him from the villains, because the villains view people as expendable pieces in a larger political game, while Rambo sees individual lives as valuable. And the film repeatedly reinforces this moral contrast. And as the story approaches the midpoint, Rambo's conflict with the command structure becomes increasingly direct, and he begins realizing that the mission's failure was not simply an accident. It was the result of people who never intended to support a full rescue operation. And this discovery changes his relationship with Troutman, because although he still trusts his former commander personally, he now understands that Troutman's authority is limited. And this is a painful realization for Rambo, because Troutman has always represented the military world that gave him purpose. And if even Troutman cannot protect him, then Rambo has to rely entirely on himself. And this reinforces the independence that has defined him since the first film. But it also isolates him, because once again he is forced to operate alone in a world where the institutions around him cannot be trusted. And this is the emotional bridge between the two movies, because despite the different scale and tone, Rambo is still struggling with the same fundamental problem. He was trained to serve, but he does not know how to live in a world where service has consequences that the people in charge refuse to acknowledge. And now he must decide what kind of soldier he wants to be: one who follows orders blindly, or one who follows his conscience. And Rambo chooses his conscience. And this decision drives the rest of the story, Because from this point forward, he is no longer simply completing a mission designed by someone else. He is creating his own mission. And that mission is to rescue the prisoners, expose the truth, and survive long enough to return home. And as the action intensifies, Rambo's relationship with the jungle becomes even more important because he uses it not only as a place to hide, but as a strategic advantage. And the enemy soldiers may have numbers and weapons, but Rambo has patience and knowledge. And this creates a recurring pattern throughout the movie where the enemy believes it has cornered him, only to discover that Rambo has turned the environment against them. And this is one of the central pleasures of the film. Watching an individual soldier use intelligence and experience to challenge a much larger force. And it also reinforces the mythology of Rambo as someone who belongs in combat. Because the jungle seems to awaken something inside him, a sense of purpose that civilian life never provided. And this is both inspiring and tragic, because the movie suggests that Rambo is extraordinarily good at the one thing that society wishes he would forget: fighting. And his return to Vietnam therefore becomes a kind of homecoming. But it is a homecoming to a place of violence rather than peace. And that contradiction defines his character. And as part 2 reaches its conclusion, Rambo's situation has become dramatically more dangerous. Because the mission has failed, the prisoners are still in danger. His own command has abandoned him, and enemy forces are closing in. But instead of giving up, Rambo prepares to fight his way back into the heart of the conflict. And he now has a clear objective. He will not leave Vietnam without the men he came to rescue. And this decision sets the stage for the explosive second half of the story, where Rambo will have to use every skill he possesses, confront the people who betrayed him, and turn the mission that was designed to control him into a mission of his own. And as he moves forward, the audience understands that the real battle is no longer simply between Rambo and the enemy. It is between Rambo and everyone who believes that soldiers can be sacrificed for political convenience. And the next stage will push that conflict to its absolute limit, as Rambo becomes the one man standing between forgotten prisoners and a system determined to keep there. The situation becomes far more dangerous once Rambo realizes that the mission was never truly designed to rescue the American prisoners he has discovered, because what was presented to him as a reconnaissance operation has turned into something much darker. And the more he learns, the more he understands that the men in command are willing to sacrifice him rather than allow the truth to become a political problem. But Rambo has never been the kind of soldier who can simply walk away from another man in trouble, especially when that man is an American soldier who has been forgotten for years. And this is what pushes him deeper into enemy territory, because the mission has stopped being about following orders and has become a personal promise. And Rambo's promise is simple: if there are American prisoners still alive in Vietnam, he will not leave them behind. And this decision changes everything, because now he is no longer working within the carefully controlled boundaries established by the people at home. He is operating according to his own judgment, and that makes him extremely dangerous to both the enemy and the officials who originally sent him. Because a soldier who follows orders can be controlled, but a soldier who believes he has a moral responsibility to complete the mission can become impossible to stop. And Rambo's determination is strengthened by the fact that Vietnam is not just another battlefield for him. It is the place where many of his memories were created, the place where he lost friends, suffered trauma, and learned how to survive. and returning to this environment brings those memories back. But instead of allowing them to destroy him, Rambo uses them to guide his decisions. And the jungle becomes a strange combination of nightmare and home, because it is a place that once nearly destroyed him, but is also a place where his skills make him feel more capable than anywhere else. And this contradiction lies at the center of the character, because Rambo is most comfortable in the environment that most people would consider unbearable, while ordinary civilian society makes him feel like an outsider. And as he continues moving through the jungle, he becomes increasingly focused on the prisoners. And the film makes it clear that he sees their situation as a reflection of his own experience, because they have been forgotten and abandoned just as he once felt forgotten after returning from the war. And this is why he is willing to risk everything to save them, because rescuing them is almost like correcting one of the greatest failures of his past. And his actions, therefore, become more than military strategy, they become a form of redemption. And as Rambo prepares to return to the prisoner camp, the film shifts into a much more aggressive action mode, because stealth alone is no longer enough, and he begins using his combat training to eliminate obstacles, destroy enemy positions, and create openings for the rescue. And this is where the sequel tone becomes noticeably different from First Blood, because the first movie was largely about one man surviving against a group of police officers, while the sequel turns Rambo into a one man army fighting through a military conflict. And the action becomes larger, louder, and more spectacular, with helicopters, boats, heavy weapons, explosions, and large groups of enemy soldiers. But the emotional reason behind the action remains the same. Rambo is fighting because someone needs his help. And this is important because without that motivation, the character could easily become a simple fantasy of violence. But the movie repeatedly reminds the audience that he is fighting for people rather than for glory. And this is particularly clear when he thinks about the soldiers still trapped in captivity, because he understands that their families may still be waiting for them, and that knowledge makes it impossible for him to abandon them. And meanwhile, Colonel Troutman is trying to understand what is happening from the other side of the operation. And he knows that Rambo is not going to simply follow an order that requires him to abandon a prisoner, because Troutman has known Rambo since his military training and understands the moral code that drives him. And although Troutman is part of the command structure, he also recognizes the injustice of what is happening. And this creates a complicated emotional connection between the two men, because Troutman is perhaps the only authority figure Rambo still respects. Yet, even Troutman is limited by the decisions of people above him, and this means that Rambo's trust in the system continues to weaken, and the audience can see that this is not simply a disagreement over tactics, it is a fundamental disagreement about what a soldier owes to the people he is sent to protect. And Rambo believes that a soldier's responsibility does not end when the mission becomes inconvenient, while the officials appear to believe that political consequences can outweigh individual lives. And this difference is what ultimately drives Rambo into open rebellion. And as the rescue operation continues, Rambo must also protect Ko Bao, who has become one of his most important allies, and her presence gives the story an emotional dimension that would otherwise be missing from the constant combat. Because Ko Bao is not simply a guide, she becomes someone Rambo trusts, And that trust is significant for a man who has spent so much of his life believing that relationships eventually lead to pain. And she helps him communicate with the local population and understand the environment, while he protects her from the violence surrounding them. And their partnership gives Rambo a brief glimpse of a life in which he might be able to connect with another person without being defined entirely by war. But the world around them is too dangerous to allow that possibility to last easily. And as Rambo continues toward the prisoners, enemy forces become increasingly aware that an American operative is moving through their territory, and the search for him becomes more intense, forcing Rambo to rely on stealth, deception, and combat skills. And this is where the film's depiction of Rambo as a highly trained special forces soldier becomes central. Because he does not simply attack randomly, he chooses his moments carefully, understands the psychology of his opponents, and uses the environment to compensate for being outnumbered. And the audience begins to see why Troutman considers him one of the most capable soldiers he has ever trained. Because Rambo can operate independently for long periods without losing focus. And this independence is both his greatest strength and the reason the authorities fear him. Because once he stops accepting their orders, they have very little ability to control him. And as the mission continues, the government officials become increasingly concerned about what Rambo might reveal if he returns with the prisoners. And this political concern becomes one of the major sources of conflict. Because admitting that American soldiers are still being held in Vietnam would create enormous pressure on the government. And the officials therefore want the situation contained while Rambo wants it exposed. And this makes him a threat to the people who sent him. And the irony is that the government has created its own problem by choosing Rambo, because they selected him precisely because he was capable of surviving behind enemy lines. But they failed to consider what would happen if he discovered something they did not want to acknowledge. And Rambo's refusal to abandon the prisoners exposes the weakness in their plan. And this is where the film's political message becomes much clearer, because it is essentially asking whether governments should be held accountable for soldiers who disappear during war, and whether political convenience should ever outweigh the responsibility to bring those soldiers home. And although the film expresses these ideas through an exaggerated action story, the emotional question remains powerful, and Rambo becomes the person who refuses to let the issue disappear. And as he moves through the jungle, he is increasingly forced to confront not only enemy soldiers but also the psychological memories of his past. And certain environments and situations remind him of the war he experienced years earlier. But unlike in the first film, where those memories were triggered against his will, here he is deliberately entering the environment that contains them. And this suggests that Rambo is trying to reclaim some control over his own history. And he is not simply returning to Vietnam because he was ordered to, he is choosing to go deeper because he believes he can make a difference. And this makes the mission emotionally significant even when the film becomes extremely action heavy. Because every step Rambo takes through the jungle is also a step toward confronting the part of himself that never escaped the war. And the prisoners therefore become symbolic as well as literal, because they represent the part of Rambo that has remained trapped in Vietnam. And by trying to rescue them, he is also trying to rescue something inside himself, the belief that his service meant something. And this emotional interpretation gives the film more depth than its reputation as an explosive 1980s action movie might suggest. And as the enemy begins closing in, Rambo is forced into increasingly direct confrontations, and his weapons become more important, especially his knife and bow, which have become iconic parts of his visual identity. And the bow in particular represents Rambo's preference for precision and stealth rather than simply overwhelming firepower, because he can eliminate threats without immediately exposing his position. And this makes him a dangerous opponent in the jungle, where visibility is limited and the terrain is difficult. And the film uses these abilities to create suspense, because the audience often knows Rambo is nearby even when the enemy does not. And this creates a predator like quality around the character, with Rambo moving silently through the environment while heavily armed soldiers search for him. And the dynamic reinforces one of the movie's most important ideas: the individual soldier versus the larger military machine. Because the enemy may have more people and more weapons, but Rambo has experience, patience, and adaptability. And these qualities allow him to survive situations that appear impossible. And the story continues building toward the moment when Rambo will have to choose between escaping with his own life and continuing to rescue the prisoners. And by now, the audience already knows what choice he will make, because Rambo's character has been defined by loyalty. And once he has committed himself to the prisoners, he cannot abandon them, even if doing so would be the safer option. And this is why Rambo is ultimately portrayed as a hero despite his violent methods, because his violence is consistently connected to protection, and the people he is fighting are either threatening him, threatening the prisoners, or trying to prevent him from exposing the truth. And the movie therefore presents his combat skills as tools that can be used for moral purposes, even though the actual violence is exaggerated for entertainment. And this is one of the major differences between Rambo and the villains, because the villains use people as tools, while Rambo uses his own skills to protect people. And this moral contrast becomes increasingly important as the story approaches its major turning point. And the relationship between Rambo and Kobau also becomes more emotionally important during this stage, because she has begun to understand the man beneath the soldier, and Rambo has begun allowing himself to trust her. And this is significant because the first movie established how deeply his experiences had damaged his ability to connect with society. So, the presence of someone who can see his humanity gives him a brief sense of hope. And for a moment, the possibility exists that Rambo might have something beyond war. But that possibility is threatened by the violence surrounding them. And this reinforces one of the movie's tragic patterns. Whenever Rambo finds a reason to hope, circumstances threaten to take it away, and the audience, therefore, becomes increasingly aware that his greatest battle may not be against the enemy soldiers but against the cycle of violence that keeps destroying every connection he makes. And this emotional dimension becomes particularly powerful because Rambo rarely explains his feelings directly. Instead, the audience understands them through his actions, his expressions, and the way he responds to people who show him kindness. And Sylvester Stallone's restrained performance allows the character to remain physically intimidating while still communicating vulnerability. And this combination became one of the defining characteristics of the Rambo image, because he is simultaneously a warrior and a wounded man. And as the mission progresses, those two identities increasingly collide, because the warrior wants to complete the rescue while the wounded man wants to believe that someone will finally stand by him. And when the people in command begin betraying him, that hope is threatened again. And Rambo responds in the only way he knows how, by taking control of the situation himself. And this is where the story begins, preparing for the next major phase. Because Rambo's independence is about to become absolute, and he will no longer wait for orders or permission. He will create his own path through the battlefield, and the people who thought they could control him will discover that their greatest mistake was believing that Rambo's loyalty meant obedience. Because for Rambo, loyalty means protecting the people who depend on him. And once those priorities conflict with official orders, he chooses the people. And this moral choice drives the film toward its most memorable action sequences. And as the enemy increases its pressure, Rambo is forced to improvise constantly, using the jungle, abandoned structures, waterways, and captured equipment to stay alive. And the movie continues presenting him as a soldier who can adapt to almost any environment. But there is always a human cost to the violence, because Rambo is being pushed deeper into the role he was trained for. And every enemy he defeats reinforces the idea that war is the only world in which he truly knows how to function. And this is one of the film's underlying tragedies, because the society that rejected him in the first movie now celebrates the same combat abilities that make him dangerous. And the sequel therefore begins transforming Rambo into a national symbol. But that transformation comes at the expense of the more complicated psychological portrait established in First Blood. And this is one reason the two films feel different despite sharing the same character. Because the first film asks what happens when a damaged veteran is pushed too far, while the sequel asks what happens when that same veteran is given an opportunity to return to the battlefield and prove himself. And Rambo's answer is that he will fight, but he will fight according to his own conscience. And as the third part moves towards its conclusion, Rambo's mission has become almost impossible because he is surrounded by enemies, betrayed by people who were supposed to support him, and responsible for the safety of prisoners who cannot defend themselves. But his determination remains stronger than the obstacles, and he prepares to continue the rescue regardless of the consequences. Because at this point, there is no longer any difference between completing the mission and proving that the forgotten soldiers matter. And this is the emotional heart of the story. Because Rambo is fighting to bring men home, but he is also fighting against the idea that soldiers can be forgotten once they are no longer politically useful. And his determination gives the movie its central message that loyalty to a fellow soldier should not disappear simply because the war has ended. And as Rambo prepares for the next stage, the enemy forces begin to realize that they are facing a soldier who will not surrender, while the officials back home begin realizing that they may have created a problem they can no longer control. And Colonel Troutman is caught between his loyalty to the military and his loyalty to Rambo. And the tension between these forces is about to explode because Rambo's refusal to follow the plan has transformed a covert mission into an open conflict, and the next stage of the story will push him into an even larger battle where he will have to rescue the prisoners, survive overwhelming enemy forces, and confront the people who betrayed him, while also proving that the soldiers who were left behind are not forgotten. And as the jungle grows darker and the danger becomes greater, Rambo prepares himself for the fight ahead, carrying the weight of his past, the responsibility of the prisoners, and the determination of a man who has finally decided that he will not allow anyone else to decide who deserves to come home. Rambo's situation reaches a critical point as the mission that was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance operation becomes a desperate fight for survival because he has discovered American prisoners of war and refuses to leave them behind, while the people who sent him into Vietnam have effectively abandoned him. And this betrayal forces Rambo to rely completely on his own instincts, training, and determination. And from this moment onward, the story becomes much more than a military mission because Rambo is now fighting against two different enemies at the same time: the enemy forces surrounding him in Vietnam, and the political system that is willing to sacrifice him to protect its own interests. And this creates one of the most important turning points in his character because he finally understands that following orders will not save the men he has found. And if he wants them to survive, he must take responsibility for the mission himself. And this is exactly what Rambo does, turning from a covert operative into a one man rescue force. And the film begins escalating the action dramatically as Rambo moves through the jungle with one objective in mind: reach the prisoners, protect them, and find a way to get them home. And his determination is strengthened by everything he has already experienced because Rambo knows what it means to be abandoned, and he refuses to allow another soldier to experience the same fate. And this emotional connection to the prisoners becomes the foundation for the action that follows. Because every fight and every risk Rambo takes is connected to his belief that these men deserve another chance at life. And as he moves through the enemy territory, his combat skills become increasingly important, and the jungle once again becomes his greatest advantage. Because Rambo understands how to move through difficult terrain, how to hide his presence, how to use natural cover, and how to strike at moments when the enemy is most vulnerable. And the enemy soldiers may have superior numbers, but they are dealing with an opponent who has spent years learning how to survive behind enemy lines. And this is where the movie fully embraces the larger action style that defined 1980s cinema. Because Rambo is no longer simply avoiding his pursuers, he is actively engaging them, and his fights become increasingly explosive with heavy weapons, vehicles, helicopters, and large scale firefights, transforming the jungle into a battlefield. But beneath the spectacle, Rambo's motivation remains deeply personal, and that emotional foundation prevents the action from becoming completely meaningless. Because the audience understands that Rambo is not fighting simply because he enjoys combat, he is fighting because the people he cares about are in danger. And this distinction is important to the character because his greatest strength is also the source of his tragedy. He knows how to fight better than almost anyone, but he has never been given a peaceful environment in which those skills could become unnecessary. And every time he tries to step away from violence, circumstances force him back into it. And now Vietnam itself has pulled him back into the world he knows best. And as Rambo continues the rescue operation, he encounters more evidence that the prisoners have been neglected for years. And this reinforces his belief that someone must act, and his determination becomes almost unstoppable because he sees the prisoners as brothers rather than strangers. And this sense of military brotherhood is one of the strongest themes throughout the movie. And it also explains why Rambo is willing to risk his own life. Because to him, the bond between soldiers does not end when the war ends. And this is a belief that stands in direct opposition to the political thinking of the officials who want the mission to remain controlled, because they are thinking about diplomacy and public consequences, while Rambo is thinking about human lives. And as the conflict grows, Colonel Trotman begins to understand that Rambo has crossed a line from which there may be no easy return. But Trotman also knows why Rambo made that decision, and their relationship becomes increasingly important because Trotman is one of the few people who can still communicate with him. And he understands that Rambo does not need another commander telling him what to do. He needs someone who recognizes what he is trying to accomplish. and this creates emotional tension between Trotman and the officials around him, because Trotman knows Rambo personally while the others see him as an asset. And the difference between those two perspectives becomes increasingly obvious. And Rambo's actions also begin exposing the weaknesses of the people who planned the operation, because the mission was designed around the assumption that no prisoners would be found. And once Rambo proves that assumption wrong, the entire political strategy begins to collapse. And instead of welcoming the discovery, the people in command become afraid of it, because admitting that American soldiers are still alive in captivity would create enormous political pressure. And this is what makes the betrayal so painful, because Rambo has done exactly what he was asked to do, only to discover that the truth is inconvenient for the people who sent him. And once again, he finds himself in the position of a soldier whose loyalty is being exploited. And this echoes the emotional core of First Blood, where Rambo explained how veterans had been used during war and then rejected afterward. And now the sequel expands that idea by showing that the system can continue abandoning soldiers even when they are still alive. And Rambo refuses to accept that, and his refusal becomes the driving force behind the second half of the film. And as he moves toward the prisoner camp, the tension between stealth and open combat becomes increasingly important, because Rambo knows that he cannot simply attack the camp directly without putting the prisoners at greater risk. So he carefully chooses his approach, studies the guards, and uses the environment to create opportunities. And these scenes demonstrate that Rambo's intelligence is just as important as his physical strength, because his greatest advantage is his ability to think like a soldier. And this is why the enemy repeatedly underestimates him, because they see one man while Rambo sees an entire battlefield. And he understands how terrain, timing, fear, and surprise can be combined to defeat a larger force. And this makes him one of the most effective fictional soldiers in action cinema. But the film also reminds the audience that this effectiveness has a cost, because Rambo is increasingly isolated, and the more he relies on his combat instincts, the further he moves away from ordinary civilian life. And this is the paradox at the center of the character. The world considers him damaged because he is a warrior, but when the world needs a warrior, he becomes its most valuable weapon. And the sequel embraces that contradiction by turning Rambo into a symbol of military strength while still keeping his personal pain underneath the action. And as the rescue continues, Bao remains by Rambo's side, and their relationship becomes one of the few emotional anchors in the story, because she sees the human being behind the legend that Rambo is becoming. And Rambo trusts her enough to share moments of vulnerability. And these quieter moments are important because they remind the audience that the man carrying the weapons and surviving the jungle is still someone who wants connection. And Kobau gives him a brief sense that life might contain something beyond war, but the circumstances surrounding them are becoming increasingly dangerous, and Rambo's enemies are closing in, and the mission is reaching a point where secrecy is no longer possible. And when Rambo is forced into open combat, the movie unleashes the full scale of its action style with gunfire, explosions, helicopters, and large enemy forces surrounding him. And this is where Rambo's transformation into the iconic action hero is fully realized, because he moves from the shadows into the center of the battlefield, no longer simply trying to avoid detection but actively taking control of the situation. And his physical strength becomes almost legendary, But the character still retains a human vulnerability because he is fighting while carrying the emotional weight of the prisoners and the betrayal of his own command. And this makes the action more personal because the audience understands that every victory is temporary and every new confrontation brings Rambo closer to the point where he will have to face the people responsible for abandoning him. And as the enemy attempts to recapture the prisoners, Rambo becomes increasingly aggressive and he begins using weapons and tactics that allow him to challenge forces far larger than himself. And this is where the movie's famous combat imagery becomes central to Rambo's identity, because the character becomes associated with his large machine gun, explosive arrows, knife, and muscular physical presence. But the most important weapon he possesses is his determination, because even when the odds become overwhelming, he refuses to stop. And this determination is rooted in loyalty rather than anger. And the audience sees that clearly when he continues risking himself for the prisoners despite having every reason to abandon the mission. And this makes him heroic in the film's moral framework because he is willing to sacrifice himself for people who cannot repay him. And this is the opposite of the officials who are willing to sacrifice him because doing so is politically convenient. And the contrast becomes increasingly sharp as the story moves toward its climax. And meanwhile, Troutman is forced to deal with the consequences of the mission from a distance, and he begins challenging the decisions of the people above him because he understands that Rambo has been betrayed. And this creates another important element of the story, the relationship between a soldier and the commander who trained him. Because Troutman feels a sense of responsibility toward Rambo that goes beyond professional duty, and he knows that Rambo's actions are partly the result of the way he was trained, because the military taught him to never abandon a fellow soldier. And now the military is asking him to do exactly that. And this contradiction is impossible for Rambo to accept, and it is also difficult for Troutman to defend. And as the rescue operation continues, Rambo manages to create a path toward extraction. But the situation remains unstable because enemy forces are determined to stop him. And the officials controlling the operation are still unwilling to fully support him. And this means Rambo must continue fighting even though he should have been rescued already. And the emotional weight of this betrayal becomes increasingly heavy because once again he is alone in a foreign land with only his own abilities to depend on. And this is exactly the situation he was supposedly sent to prevent. And the movie therefore transforms the rescue mission into a battle for recognition because Rambo is not simply trying to bring the prisoners home, he is trying to force the people in power to acknowledge that the prisoners exist and that they deserve to be rescued. And this becomes the larger symbolic meaning of his mission. And as Rambo pushes forward, he becomes increasingly determined to expose the truth. And this sets up the final conflict between him and the military officials who abandoned him, because he now understands that simply returning home quietly will not be enough, and he wants the world to know what happened. And this is where the film begins building toward its famous climax. Because Rambo will soon have access to the communications and military equipment necessary to make his message impossible to ignore. And the audience can sense that the final confrontation will not simply be a physical battle. It will also be a battle over truth, responsibility, and the value of the soldiers who were left behind. And as the action grows more intense, Rambo continues fighting through the jungle, moving with the confidence of someone who has returned to the environment that shaped him. And although the violence is extreme, his purpose remains surprisingly simple: bring the prisoners home. And this simplicity is what keeps the story focused. Because no matter how complicated the politics become, Rambo's personal goal never changes. And that consistency is one of the strongest elements of his character. Because he does not allow bureaucracy, fear, or betrayal to change what he believes is right. And this also explains why the character became such a powerful symbol for audiences, because he represents the individual who refuses to accept that a system's decision automatically makes something morally acceptable. And as the rescue reaches its most dangerous stage, Rambo finds himself facing overwhelming forces. But he uses his knowledge of the jungle to turn the situation around. And the movie increasingly portrays him as a force of nature, moving through enemy territory with determination and precision. And every successful attack makes his enemies more frightened, while every obstacle makes him more determined. And this escalation leads directly toward the final stage of the mission, where Rambo will have to fight his way toward extraction while protecting the prisoners, and the film's action spectacle reaches a new level as helicopters and enemy forces dominate the battlefield, and Rambo is forced to use heavier weapons and more aggressive tactics. And yet, even in these explosive scenes, the emotional core remains visible because the prisoners are still at the center of everything he is doing. And Rambo's actions are ultimately about proving that their lives matter. And as the story approaches its final act, the consequences of the mission become impossible to hide, because the people who attempted to control Rambo have now lost control completely, and the soldier they believed they could use and discard has become the one person capable of exposing their failure. And Colonel Troutman now faces the difficult task of deciding where his loyalty lies. And Rambo's actions have forced everyone around him to confront the moral consequences of abandoning soldiers. And this is where the film moves toward its emotional and action climax. Because Rambo is no longer fighting simply to survive, he is fighting to make sure the truth survives with him, and the next stage will bring him face to face with the people responsible for the betrayal, while also giving him the opportunity to rescue the prisoners and return home. And the deeper meaning of his mission becomes clear. Rambo is trying to prove that the men who disappeared in Vietnam were not forgotten, that their lives still matter, and that someone must be willing to fight for them even when the institutions that promise to protect them refuse to do so. And as Rambo prepares for the final confrontation, he is carrying more than weapons into battle. He is carrying years of anger, guilt, loyalty, trauma, and hope. And all of those emotions are about to explode in the film's final and most memorable sequence.